As an art instructor at the Heron School of Art, 1922 to 1933, Paul Hadley specialized in watercolors and outdoor sketches. Paul became assistant curator of the Art Association, 1935 to 1936. He traveled the country, capturing distinctively local scenes that defined mid-20th century Hoosier and American culture. Paul Hadley did not drive a car. Instead, he traveled along the interurban railway, rode trolleys and buses, and hiked cross-country to paint the scenic views. His ability to capture the essence of his subjects was matched by superb use of color and realism, softened with impressionistic tones. Let's look at Paul Hadley's paintings, currently on display at Mooresville Public Library. Margaret Colee's Pump House. This painting was representative of Paul Hadley's typical subject and design. A pink peach tree contrasts with the cool gray building and blue sky, and the details of a tub, rainwater barrel, and copper bucket add a sense of nostalgia. Lucille E. Morehouse, art critic for the Indianapolis Star. Paul Hadley displayed this painting at the 1939 Indiana State Fair. Margaret Colee lived in an unnumbered house between 204 and 222 East High Street in Mooresville. According to a family member, one of her uncles may have stored home brew in this pump house to keep it cool. Maysfield, Kentucky. The Maysfield, Kentucky painting shows gray buildings set even with the walk, and a large flowering shrub with yellow blossoms in the center. Paul Hadley asked Claire Cook a question about business. When Cook said there was no charge for this information, Hadley brought several paintings and told him to select the one he liked. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley. This painting belonged to the estate of Helen Cook. In her biography of Paul Hadley, Morgan County historian Becky Harden misspelled the town name. There is no Maysfield, Kentucky. Instead, there is a Mayfield, Kentucky in Graves County, in the extreme southwestern end of Kentucky, and a Maysville, Kentucky in Mason County along the Ohio River. The architectural designs captured in Hadley's painting are much more similar to houses in older parts of Maysville than to those in Mayfield, suggesting that the correct title should be Maysville, Kentucky. Brooklyn, Indiana covered bridge. When Mr. and Mrs. Lawson Lawrence were married, Lawson's mother asked them to select one of Paul Hadley's paintings for a wedding gift. They liked two of them so well they purchased another in addition to the wedding present. Lawson especially liked the Brooklyn Covered Bridge, which was on the east side of Brooklyn. He had fished under the bridge. After the pictures were framed, Paul Hadley came to their house and drove a nail in the wall, and explained many people hang pictures too high. The Lawrences still hang their pictures low on the wall. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley. The covered bridge in this painting was replaced by a concrete structure built in 1948. Tree and house. Little is known about this painting. The structure may have been located in or around Mooresville. Mooresville Nature Club medallions. In 1958-59 and 1962-63, Paul Hadley painted original miniature pictures for the program covers of the Mooresville Nature Study Club, of which he was a member. His cousin, Miss Emma May Hadley, gave some of these to the Mooresville Library, where they are framed into two small pictures. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley. The miniatures shown here are on loan to the library from an anonymous patron. The others that Emma Hadley donated to the library are kept in the Indiana Room archives. Dairy barn and silo. This barn and silo were situated on a farm near the birthplace of Paul Hadley's father, Dr. Evan Hadley, on Bethel Road, near State Road 42, just southwest of Mooresville. The painting belonged to the estate of Becky Harden. Madison, Indiana, and Ohio River. Paul Hadley exhibited this painting in his one-man show in 1931. The scene overlooks Madison, Indiana, on the Ohio River. Tree in front of Matthew Comer House. The Matthew Comer House, built 1871, once stood at 218 East South Street in Mooresville. It was demolished in 1996. Smokehouse. Paul Hadley painted several scenes featuring smokehouses. Although the location of this particular smokehouse is unknown, it was probably somewhere in or around Mooresville. This painting was presented to the library by Mr. and Mrs. Lawson Lawrence. Room at Roselon. This painting of the living room at Roselon was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Claire Cook. Helen Cook thinks it is one of the best Paul Hadley ever did. The deep dark wood of the recessed window and the melodeon have unusual depth. The ladder-back chair and portrait of Lincoln are an interesting bit of Americana, and the rug was typical of pioneer days. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley. This painting was presented to the library by Claire and Helen Cook. East Fork of White Lick Creek. Mrs. Claude, Mary, Stokesbury's family, asked artist Paul Hadley to paint a picture for her birthday present. At that time she was living in Hadley's former home on Lockerbie Street. He called one day, making an excuse that he wanted to see how they had remodeled the house. The painting was designed to fit over the fireplace and is wider than it is high. Since Mrs. Stokesbury has moved to a retirement home, her son John has the painting. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley. The painting was presented to the library by John P. Stokesbury. A. M. Saylor. Saylor was a law student when Hadley painted his portrait, which won a prize at the Indiana State Fair. Cataract Falls. Since Paul Hadley didn't drive an automobile, many of his friends drove him around to places to paint. I once took him to Cataract Falls. Watching Paul paint was a wonder. His hands were a blur of motion as he captured the waterfalls. Fred Glidden. This painting was presented to the library by Mr. and Mrs. Rodney Hayworth. It portrays Cataract Falls on Mill Creek, south of Cloverdale, in northern Owen County, Indiana. Spoon or Robb Cabin, 1939. This painting was presented to the Mooresville Library by the Tri Kappa sorority. A newspaper story says it is the Robb Cabin, but some people think it was the Spoon home. Spoon's cabin was the subject of Hadley's paintings at different seasons of the year. One is Spoon's Gate, and was probably for Spoon's cabin. Spoon's Gate is owned by one of Hadley's cousins, Mrs. Harold Swift. The gate is something like the one in Hadley's cabin painting shown here, which has an open gate. Although the location may have been the same, the paintings are different. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley. Simon Moon's Cabin. Paul Hadley displayed this painting either at the 1924 or 1931 Heron Art Institute exhibition in Indianapolis. Simon Moon, 1786-1879, was a Quaker who settled in Morgan County during the early 1830s. He lived near Long Ridge, a few miles southwest of Mooresville, on what is today known as North Bunker Hill Road. Moon's cabin was immediately west of the Bethel Friends meeting. Simon Moon was known to have sheltered runaway slaves in his home along the Underground Railroad. When the cabin was destroyed, Mrs. Lindley said there were 2 closed spaces that were discovered on either side of the fireplace, large enough to hold 2 people. The only entrance was from the attic. It is thought this may have been a place to hide runaway slaves. Becky Harden, biographer of Paul Hadley.